Critical appreciation of the preface to the lyrical ballad, 1802. Wordsworth begins his preface to the lyrical ballad to 1802 edition by referring to the 1798 edition of his poems. He shows that the first edition of the lyrical ballad was published as an experiment to lest whether poems written in a state of emotional and excitement can give that pleasure which the readers naturally expect from a volume of poetry. He hopes that his poems would either give uncommon pleasure to the readers or uncommon dislike. It was a new kind of poetry that he had experimented with, and he knew that the reactions of the readers would be extreme kind, and consequently Wordsworth succeed in imparting the poetic pleasure which readers expect from a poet. In the volume, he has included a few poems of his friend St. Coleridge. Some of the poet's friend advised Wordsworth to add a preface in the second edition of Lyrical Ballad in defense of his theory of poetry, stating his aims and objectives. But the poet refused to do so in defense of the theory of poetry and lastly contemplates on it and decided to add a preface only for an in- introduction of the volume and poetry. Introduction of the volume and poetry, not in defense of it due to some reason. William Wordsworth stated that if there is a worth in his verses, appreciation would come by itself without any reasoning or argumentation on his part. The readers read his poem because the poet has found out their tastes and pleasure because they has accustomed of Pope's poetry and his school at that period of time. So they find newness and beyond disappointment pleasure in his verses. Wordsworth has written the poems with a definite purpose in mind. His purpose has been to choose incidents and situations from common life, and his selection of language is really common, used by men. He has chosen the various aspects of humble and rustic life because of the following reason. The essential passions of human heart find an unrestrained, free, and frank expression in humble and rustic surroundings. The elementary feelings of the human heart exist in condition of greater simplicity of life. The manner of rustic life are not sophisticated. They spring directly from their elementary feelings and can be understood more easily. His aim was to understand human nature and it can be best understood in the simple condition of rustic life. In rustic condition, human passions are deeply associated with the beauteous forms of external nature, and so they are more noble and permanent than the emotion of city folk. The poet has adopted rustic and slangs language in his poems because of some reasons. First reason is people living in rustic surroundings communicate with best part of human language. Second, human feelings find an unsophisticated, simple expression in rustic language and so on. William Wordsworth next points out that his poems differ from the popular poetry of the day Each of the poem has been written with a worthy purpose in lyrical ballad, that of enlightening the readers and purifying their affection. His thoughts always connects one thought with another, as he defines poetry. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and a poet is a man endowed with nature and simple use of language. In his poems, sentiments are more important than action and situation. Feeling gives importance to action and situation, and not vice versa. His aims in this poem is to show the human mind craving even without the use of gross and violent sensation. He thinks that in big cities where a large number of people live their lives in crowd and the sameness of their occupation make their lives monotonous and bored, and so they crave excitement through sensation that is uncommon incidents and situation. This craving is satisfied by newspapers, the theaters, and other forms of cheap literature. They cannot enjoy between great and noble works of Shakespeare's Milton and the cheap sensational literature. So they will crave for a new pleasure of mind in a very uncommon way of poetry. He has hopes of success in his purpose. Wordsworth reaches to the consideration of his poetic styles. He never uses personification of abstract ideas which the contemporary poets did to elevate their style above prose. His purpose is to use the very language of man, but he uses personification men emotionally excited and they do so. He has avoided poetic diction so that he can come close to the language of common people which the poets used in poetic diction at that time. He imparts a true poetry to the readers. In other words, he has been true to nature and has used a natural style. Thus, he has compelled to avoid the use of phrases and figures of a speech that have been traditionally used by poets. Wordsworth describes about the language of prose and poetry that there is no essential difference between these two rather than the only difference the two arises from the use of meter. Wordsworth concludes that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Critics point out that the use of rhythm and meter found the language of poetry from that of prose. It is said that poetry differs from prose and the use of poetic diction is as much a source of pleasure as rhyme and meter. But Wordsworth does not agree with such views. He recommends that the use of a selection of language really used by man. If this section is made with the true taste and feeling, the language of poetry would be free from coarseness and vulgarity of ordinary life. In his own poem, he has tried to use such language. Thus, according to Wordsworth, meter is not essential for poetry. There can be poetry even without meter. Meter is merely a pleasure uh, superadded. A poet speaks either in his own person or through the mouth of his characters. When speaking through character, he must use proper language and figures of speech to elevate his poetic style. The passion which the poet wants to convey would elevate the style with suitable metaphors and similes. Thus, Wordsworth demonstrates the uselessness of such artificial and unnatural poetic devices as the poetic diction of Pope and his followers. Wordsworth emphasizes again on his objectives about preface. He wants to convince the readers and create faith. It would be realized that Chaucer and Shakespeare were not barbarians, barbarians but greater poets than Pope and Popians. We may add that Wordsworth did succeed in bringing out about such a revolution in literary taste. This is the historical significance of the preface. Wordsworth now gives us his romantic conception and functions. He is a person who writes not for his own pleasure but his thoughts and emotion to his readers. He has greater knowledge of human nature and a passion which he has experienced. He has more comprehension soul and can share the emotional experience, feelings, and emotion of others. And lastly, he is a man who has greater power of expression and communication. The poet no doubt has a power of communication. Now the poet has a new challenge of his selection of language, which he picks up from very life of common people. Therefore, the poet should try to achieve emotional identification with characters, and the function of poetry gives pleasure and the end of principle. The term pleasure means not the action of amusement but very truth of life, which Wordsworth tries to convey us. Thus his approach is characteristically romantic but not classic. Critics point out that a poet is a translator, so he translates his emotion and feelings through poetry, and he conveys us everything which observes and contemplates on that particular action. Wordsworth refers to Aristotle's view that poetic truth is much higher than the truth of history and philosophy. According to Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, poetry is more philosophical than philosophy itself. It is the most philosophical of all writings, while history deals merely with particular facts and philosophy deals with the abstract truth. Poetry alone deals both with the particular and general. Poetry aims at universal truth, as it is said, poetry is an image of man and nature. This is the only obstacle between poet and the truth. Poetic diction comes in the way of truth, and so it must not be restored by the poet. The function of poetry gives immediate pleasure, and every action in life, like sympathy, feeling, living, moving, and so on, gives pleasure. Even knowledge and the painful is source of pleasure. Each and every reality and universal truth which we feel and observe through sensation part that gives us pleasure as the poet perceive and describe. The scientist also works hard in search for truth. He also finds pleasure in truth, but is limited only to the individual scientist. And it cannot be shared, but poetry is fact of unity of nature and man, which can be shared with others. Poetry in this respect is far superior to science. The scientist studies only appearance of things. On the other hand, the poet goes down to the inner reality as Wordsworth defines, the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge, the impassioned experience which is in the countenance of all signs. Thus, poetry is the first and last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. Poetry is something sublime, noble, and such as the stylistic device known as poetic diction. Further, Wordsworth reasons against poetic diction that the poet speaks through the character's mouth. The poet does not write for self gratification, but to communicate to others. His own thoughts and feelings, and the language used by very common men. As it is said, Poets do not write for poets alone but for men. Thank you. For more video upon English literature, subscribe my channel English Literature 360 degree YouTube DP.